Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor. And today, we're recording this during Holy Week, and I think it's a very a proper time to be discussing this, though it will probably be released after Easter because I don't want to get people distracted too much during Holy Week. But today we're going to be talking about Christian persecution. My guest here today is Dr. Thomas Williams, who wrote the book on it. Basically, "The Coming Christian Persecution" is the name of the book. It is with it's Crisis Publications, right?
That's right, which is a
Yeah.
division of Sophia Institute Press.
Yeah, that always confuses me a little bit. But thank you for coming on the show to discuss your book, Dr. Williams. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, Connor. It's not a very pleasant subject, but I think it's a very important one today, and it's one that a lot of people are not aware of how serious it is. So I think it's worth our discussion.
Yeah, and it really is. It's something that I think will surprise many people about how important this topic is, as people might think that uh, people think that we've progressed in society. That's a big message of the world today, is that we're progressing, we're getting beyond such things. But it seems to me, especially from your book, that we're kind of just getting started on a phase of Christian persecution.
Well, every indicator points that way, and it's kind of a dire reality, but it's a true one. Pope John Paul II, leading up to the year 2000, said we were headed for a new age of martyrs, and he was a very prophetic man. He saw a lot of things coming, and we've really seen that it's true. It's coming true in our day. You know, whether it's from Islamic extremists of the Islamic State or Boko Haram in Nigeria or in the Middle East, or whether it's radical secularists, even in the West, which used to be a bastion of religious liberty and support for Christianity. We really see that in all parts of the world, this is really a growing phenomenon, and the resistance to it is going less and less.
Yeah. Will you give the audience sort of a definition, like what constitutes persecution for, especially for Christians?
Persecution, it takes different forms. Obviously, the most radical and historically the most impactful, if you will, type of persecution is martyrdom. The red persecution, red martyrdom, the shedding of blood, being killed for odium fidei, for hatred of the faith, specifically for belonging to Jesus Christ, for proclaiming Jesus Christ to the world. People are killed, and this continues to happen in our own day. There are hundreds every single year of Christian martyrs right now. But there are many other forms of this as well. There are those, who are just discriminated against in the sense that they lose their jobs, or they are treated as second-class citizens, depending on where they live, or they are put in prison, another form of persecution. And then there are somewhat lighter forms that we experience in the West, which easily then become some of the harder forms, whether it's just ridicule or ostracization, being treated as someone who is not worthy of being at the table because of these antiquated, if you will, Bronze Age beliefs, as some of them are now saying when they speak of the Bible. Something, just be treated as if you are lower than the rest of humanity because you espouse these beliefs and because of your adherence to Jesus.
Yeah, it does seem like violence grows when a society deems a certain group of people antithetical to their society.
It's a really, really important point, Connor. And I think that that's what we're seeing more and more in the West, where Christianity used to be, everybody assumed that other people were either Christian or, were living in a Christian culture and basically espoused fundamental Christian beliefs about God, about family, about the relationship of the state and the individual, et cetera, all these different things. And nowadays, Christians are looked upon more and more with suspicion and hostility as being really part of the problem of society. They tar us with names like Christian nationalists or white supremacists or theocrats or homophobes or people who are against progress because of fundamental Christian beliefs in, for example, man and woman made by God, two sexes, not 52. Basic beliefs about religious liberty and freedom and the ability to proclaim and practice our faith in public, or whether it's about the sacredness of and inviolability of human life and our defense of the unborn. These are all things that get in the way of a radical secularist agenda and making Christians out to be really the problem, something that is holding back the progress that society is meant to have.
Yeah. I think people also have this false understanding that persecution or martyrdom ended when Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire. But really, you see, especially amongst Christians, once there becomes different heresies or different Protestant sects, there becomes this violence uh, and persecution of very much Catholics, especially and Protestants alike. But obviously, that fighting. So there's always been a danger to being Christian, even when Christianity was so widespread post the Roman Empire.
Well, absolutely. And that's a very important point, too. And I think that, Jesus told his disciples, he told us that this is what we should expect, that if you're going to follow me, the disciple will always be like his master. If they hated me, they will hate you too. This is something that he promised us. In fact, you could say he warned us, but in a way, he also gave us this gift. You will share also in my cross in this way, which is, also a badge of honor for Christians. And I think it's something that, as much as we hate it, our flesh, if you will, rebels against it because it's not a pleasant thing. It is also a sign of our fidelity to Christ. And I think that, sometimes we could have more to worry about if we suffer nothing for Christ's name. If everybody loves us and the world embraces us, we should wonder then what we're doing wrong, not when we're mistreated.
Yeah. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Where is that from? Who said that? Do you know?
That is from an early philosopher named Tertullian, who was a Christian philosopher more than a theologian. And he coined that phrase because of the Roman persecution of the Roman Empire and how many people converted to Christianity because of that. And he's often cited because what was a reality then has been a reality down through the ages.
Yeah. There's kind of an interesting pop culture reference that I'm going to make about this. Is there in the first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi is killed by Darth Vader, but before he says that, if you kill me, I'll become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. It really reminds me, just for people who really like Star Wars, especially, it's kind of similar insofar as the power of martyrdom has a greater impact, not just on the person, but on everyone around.
That is true, and I thank you, by the way, for citing an early Star Wars, the very first, which I saw in theaters. I'm old enough to have seen that in theaters. If you cited some of the later ones, I might not be able to follow your reference, but that one, that's a fantastic movie, and it's a fantastic figure. The figure of Obi-Wan Kenobi, in many ways, is kind of a Christic figure in the sense that he does give his life. Remember, in the end of that, he's fighting, but in the end, he holds up his lightsaber and he is smitten, but he knows what's going to happen after that with the rebel alliance and the overthrow of that evil regime, if you will.
Yeah, the old Star Wars movies, the original trilogy, have in more in common, I think, with Christianity than the later ones. But yeah. So overall, in regards to persecution today, is the international scene and as well as the cultural setup in the West, is it kind of a perfect storm for Christian persecution? Is it creating this basically? Is this allowing it to happen?
Well, it is exactly a perfect storm. That's a fantastic way to put it because the drivers of Christian persecution are getting stronger and stronger. There's no sign of any let up. If anything, they're intensifying. But at the same time, we have a dropping of the guard in the West in traditional historic strongholds of Christianity, those who defended Christianity throughout the world, and especially in the form of religious liberty, which is something we see being weakened day by day in our own culture, and coupled finally with a widespread ignorance. Another reason that I thought it was important to write this book, and I'm so glad, I'm grateful to you for having me on your show as well, is because so many people just don't know, because mainstream media does not cover the persecution of Christians. Despite the fact that it's a real daily reality in so many parts of the world, it's something that is either intentionally ignored or suppressed, or simply through ignorance not covered.
Yeah. Also, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but I will have the link to your book in the description, and I really encourage people to go out and buy the book and support your work. It's very important, and as well as it will help everyone have an idea on what they can be doing to prepare and how they should react to persecution if it comes their way specifically.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. Yeah, I mean that's a huge part of it too. Just being ready. Jesus said so many times in the gospel, "Be prepared. You do not know the day nor the hour," and that obviously can refer to our death, but it also refers to moments of ordeal and trial where we're put to the test. And I think that readiness and that awareness of what it takes to be ready is really essential for Christians today.
You mentioned the freedom of religion, especially in the United States, but also other places in the West where that's sort of always or has been a codified thing for a while. Uh, has the freedom of religion really become the freedom from religion at this point?
Yeah, it's honestly one of the most tragic aspects of this whole scenario, especially in a country which we love, the United States of America, which was really founded on religious freedom. It's not only America's first freedom, it's the reason those initial pilgrims came over to the United States, which was at the time obviously not the United States of America, but to the continent of
Hmm.
America, because they were trying to escape from a regime in England which was oppressive to beliefs that were outside of the mainstream. And they wanted to go to a place where they could worship God freely. America was founded on the worship of God, the Christian God, and by people who believed that everyone should have a right to practice that freedom. And it's tragic in my mind when in our own day we see the diminishment and sometimes the direct attack on this. They will often say that it's an excuse for discrimination. If you're talking especially about LGBT questions, simply because Christians are unwilling to celebrate something that they believe to be fundamentally wrong and fundamentally displeasing to God. Obviously, without hatred in our hearts, that's not the point. And it's often colored that way, as if anytime you make a distinction and say, "I'm sorry, I don't believe that that's right," that necessarily in some way you're a hater. And that's something we would deny, but those are the labels that are often used. And right now we see religious liberty in the US kind of being downgraded first to the level of all other rights. In other words, its pride of place that it had before has now been completely lost. So whenever it kind of butts heads with another presumed right, it's thought to be no more important. And secondly, in many cases, it's actually downgraded below that as something that is not even really worthy of talking about. Again, this whole idea of belief in a radically secularist society is something that is considered inferior.
Is there a right now that you would say is real has taken its pride of place?
Well, honestly, in terms of social discourse right now, it really has to do, I think, with LGBT rights. And again, I don't mean to attack that particular agenda and that particular group of people, but the one that we see constantly, and a lot of the attacks against Christianity come from more aggressive members of that particular lobby group or extended. I don't like calling it a community. They speak about the LGBT community, but in many ways, it really does not fit the definition of a community. But anyway, that
Yeah.
particular interest group is often considered that's a higher right in some way than people's conscience or religious rights. For example, to simply say we believe in one man, one woman marriage.
Yeah, they call a lot of people communities that don't really count as communities. But so how wide is the persecution, especially outside the United States? Obviously, it's mostly outside of the United States, but how wide? Like, can you give us some real figures?
Yeah, I think there are two key statistics that people should keep in mind because they really kind of sum up the nature of the problem and just how widespread it is. And the first is this, according to Open Doors, which is a Christian persecution watchdog group that monitors this every year. They do lots and lots of studies on this question. And they said in their latest World Watch List, which is a yearly report they put out, that 360 million Christians live in a situation of serious to severe Christian persecution. In other words, those not like us, not those who can be ostracized or marginalized or treated badly or harassed in some way, but those who actually are in fear for their lives, fear of shedding their blood. And that's just a massive number. 360 million people is more than the entire population of the United States. It's a horrendous number of people that live in daily fear for their lives because of their Christian faith. The second statistic is another one that I think shocks a lot of people who don't follow this topic regularly, which is that if you look around the world, all the people who suffer any kind of persecution for their faith, whatever that faith might be, 3 out of 4 of those, a full 75%, are Christians. In other words, 3/4 of people who in the world suffer persecution for the sake of their religious belief belong to the Christian religion. So
Yeah.
that's another, and put those two together, and you get a situation that is, I think, astonishing and something that is really kind of very problematic for our world today.
That's terrifying. I can't imagine being in that situation. So that's just extraordinarily terrifying. Um, is there any are there any countries that are Christian countries or even other countries looking out for these persecuted Christians?
Another great question. This is part of the problem that I was trying to allude to a little bit earlier, in the sense that those historic defenders of Christianity, of Christians, and of freedom of worship, freedom of belief, and freedom of religious practice have
Mhm.
waned so far that they not only are not standing up and defending, but in a way they are participating in a at least implicitly in a cover up, in the sense that this is something that is simply not being reported on, so people are unaware that it's happening. There's even a real denial of the problem despite this magnitude of the problem. I'll give you just one example. You might have read this in the book. I include this in the book, but it's something that astonishes me. So Wikipedia actually has an entire entry on something they call Christian persecution complex. And they go in to
Mhm.
describe how many Christians imagine that they are persecuted because it makes them feel like better Christians. It makes them feel closer to Jesus. And when I read that, I was dumbfounded, because I was picturing to myself, can you imagine if Wikipedia made a web page for Jewish persecution complex, the outrage if they did that, or you know Islamic persecution complex? People would be up in arms, but they feel perfectly in their rights to make something that alluding to Christians. So this is hugely problematic. I will say there's one very, unfortunately, very small but beautiful counter example of this, and that is the nation of Hungary, which still considers itself to be a Christian nation. It's not a confessional state in the sense it doesn't have a state religion, but the leader, the prime minister, and all, they basically say, we are a Christian nation. This was founded as a Christian nation. St. Stephen of Hungary was among our founders, et cetera. This is something we believe in. And they are the only country that I'm aware of that actually has a ministry within their government of aid to persecuted Christians in the world. And what they do is they give money, but they also actually send teams out and they rebuild schools and homes. And they come to the defense and the aid of Christians who are persecuted. And they do it, I like this also very much, to help them also stay where they are. They kind of reject the model of, all right, so if you're being attacked in Mosul, you should just leave there and go to some other country. They say, no, you should stay there. We will help you to rebuild. We will help you to be able to hold on to your homeland instead of to be a victim of this kind of forced migration.
Yeah. That's interesting that Hungary is the main example to the contrary. If this was any other religion, would there be a greater number of countries up in arms?
I mean, I think so. Certainly, the Islamic states, there's still obviously a number of Islamic states, confessionally Islamic states in the world that do come to the defense of Muslims who are in need, who are persecuted. I think in the West right now too, since the radical secularists really do see Christianity as the problem and not the solution, I think they would rather support anybody else rather than the actual victims of this persecution who are Christians. They don't want in any way to be seen as being supportive or to be showing Christians as victims and martyrs, because that only obviously raises the stock in Christianity. What they want to do is diminish and make it look like Christians are always the perpetrators and never the victims of this kind of abuse.
Yeah. What country in or what Christian or sorry, in what country are Christians most persecuted?
Well, by one standard, where Christians are most likely to die for their faith, the winner is Nigeria. And this is something else that I find very problematic, because a couple of years ago, President Joe Biden decided that it was time to take Nigeria off the list of what are called CPCs, or countries of particular concern, which is something that the State Department designates certain countries as countries of particular concern because of their religious persecution, not specifically Christian. And Joe Biden decided that Nigeria should no longer be on that list, despite the fact that Christians die at a higher rate in Nigeria than anywhere else in the world. And again, this is something we often don't hear about. I'll give you another, if we have time, I'll give you an example of this that I find particularly striking. In 2019, in the month of March, I think you will remember this, and I bet your listeners, your viewers will also. There was a horrific crime down in Christchurch, New Zealand, where a man went into two different mosques and he started shooting. I believe he killed 51 Muslims. It was absolutely horrible.
Oh,
And this was on the front page of all the newspapers. It made top billing in all cable news and different news programs on television. What you didn't hear about, and it deserved that, by the way, it should have gotten top billing. But what you didn't hear about was that very week there were 220 Christians killed in Nigeria, specifically targeted because of their faith. There were entire villages wiped out.
wow.
Some were killed with machetes. Some were burned alive in their homes. Some were shot. This was an absolutely terrible thing. And I actually did the research on this. It was not covered by any major newspaper in the United States, nor by any news station on television. I
I'm
mean,
not
so,
surprised.
I mean, that's something, either that's willful or it is such ignorance that these are people that don't even deserve the title as journalists.
Well, it's a narrative thing. They need things to maintain the same narrative. So if there was another shooting of Muslims, they would have just continued on with their story, but adding that to the story. But something that sort of, if something kind of detracts from their narrative, even if their narrative is you shouldn't harm Muslims or something like that, the point more has to be that they want to make people think that only Muslims are persecuted, or that Christians are villainous.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's a very insightful. And we see that in terms of religion. We see it also in terms of these other groups. I mean, just recently we experienced that horrific shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville, and the way a lot of news agencies reported on this, since the actual perpetrator of the crime was a 28-year-old transgender woman. They said because transgender people are so persecuted, that's why they're lashing back out. In other words, they rushed to the defense, and rather than say there's something problematic here about this hatred of Christians attacking a Christian school, they said, well, it's because society is so unfriendly to transgender people that we're getting this kind of violence. It's a logical response. In other words, putting kind of the burden back on those who find it problematic when people you have to refer to people as members of the sex other than their own because they want to be or believe themselves to be members of that sex.
Yeah, it's creating the idea that it's okay to kill Christians uh, because of what they believe, and that it's just and and giving an excuse is basically just giving a justification.
Absolutely. Basically it says, well, Christians brought this on themselves. They deserve
Hmm.
it. They don't say that in so many words, but that's the clear underlying message that they are giving.
They're almost kind of clear. They're inching their way up to being that clear. In some ways, it's pretty surprising that they are coming so close to that. Um,
Yeah, and it is. I think the word you chose is the right one, very apt. It's the narrative. They want to control the narrative. You probably remember the Covington, Kentucky student, Nick Sandeman, who at the March for Life 3 years ago was pilloried and made to look as if he were harassing Native Americans when actually the final news came out and you saw the full video, you saw that the group actually came and provoked him. They came and stood in his face and he didn't react. But it made it
yeah,
look like, his protesting against abortion was some way, directed against these Native Americans who, and it turns out when we've got the backstory on this, particularly the leader of that particular group, has been very provocative. This is something that he goes around regularly and does because he tries to get white people in trouble.
yeah. And the thing they highlighted specifically, a lot of people on Twitter was like his smile, his like Nick
Yeah.
Sandman's smile, and talking about how it's he has a punchable face, and really emphasizing the desire to inflict harm on him.
Yeah, and they got away with that. I mean, that is something. It's the double standard was very apparent there because if you said that about other people, you would be banned from Twitter. You'd be shut down on Facebook because these are things that are considered provocations to violence. And yet, people were saying this about Sandeman. Who was just a high school kid for goodness sake, who was just out there peacefully demonstrating on behalf of life. And yet, yeah, you could say he has a very punchable face, and it was provocative.
I just thought it was amazing because they're talking about a child. They were he was, I believe he was younger than 18, so
Yeah,
he was a minor, and they're talking about hurting a minor
yeah.
who, even by legal standards, doesn't really isn't fully or responsible in that area, because he hasn't matured all the way out of into adulthood. So it's just a crazy thing to go from like basically they have a problem with children, or with young adults being anything other than um, these progressive activists.
Well, that's exactly right. And basic standards of human decency are just set aside when that person happens to get in the way of their agenda, and we see that happening. And in this case, he was a Christian boy. He was out because he really believed he went with his school, but he was wearing a MAGA hat, and he, obviously was, there on behalf of the unborn, and that was an unacceptable position. And so his status as a minor, I think he was 16, if I'm not mistaken, he was 16 at the time, um, was insufficient. That was waived, if you will, simply because he was on the wrong side of the fence.
Yeah, it, yeah, exactly. And it just shows how vulnerable, maybe not to, obviously not at this point to red martyrdom, but there is a white martyrdom that can be, or white persecution at least, that is in effect in ways in Christian, or formerly Christian countries, probably.
Yeah, and more, and we're seeing this with targeted FBI, harassment, serious harassment of pro-life people, or against you. You saw this, I'm sure, recently. Also, people who go to the Latin Mass, they were considered especially susceptible to becoming Christian nationalists and white supremacists, which is, I mean, on the face of it, it's ridiculous. But the fact that the FBI would actually target them and go after them, obviously they had to suppress that document. That document was leaked by a whistleblower, and they had to disown it as quickly as they could. But the fact that this is going on is really, really distressing. And we've been seeing this. I mean, this has been going on for some years now. I remember very well because it was a good friend of mine, Amy Coney Barrett, when she was first up for U.S. District Court. She'd been named. The religious hazing that she suffered at the hands of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Remember, Dianne Feinstein said to her, you know, the dogma lives loudly in you. And Dick Durbin, who is supposedly, at least nominally, a Catholic himself, had the same kind of, you know, really religious-based hazing. It was almost a religious litmus test for that office. The sense that she was so devout that in some way would inhibit her to be an unbiased judge on the district court. You know, happily it was a little less for that when she was named for the Supreme Court, because she'd already been so raked over the coals the first time.
Yeah, you can't really do much more than what they already did. And plus, it probably would have gotten even more attention with a Supreme Court nomination if they had done anything more in that case.
And there was thankfully some pushback. There was some pushback after that because it was so egregious. The way that they treated her was just unworthy of that committee. And there was another judge later that year, Brian Busher, who was up for a similar post, who went through a very similar sort of hazing. His was primarily because he belonged to the Knights of Columbus, of all things. This large organization. It was, you know, John F. Kennedy was a member of the Knights of Columbus, for goodness sake. I mean, this is something, but they said that this is an anti-LGBT organization. Again, they bring out these same topics to make it look like Christians are bigots.
Those pancake breakfasts are very dangerous, I'd say. But,
exactly. They undermine our nation's integrity.
Yeah. That's a wild claim. So going back to especially Nigeria is in the book you say it's about, I think, 47% Christian.
Yeah, that's right. It's got a lot of Christians. It's predominantly geographically broken up. But the thing is this, that a lot of the Muslims in Nigeria in particular are very, very hostile. They're very aggressive and very violent. So something that started kind of in the north with Boko Haram, there were mass kidnappings, there were mass killings of Christians, and that is registered as an Islamic terror group. But then we had a problem spreading down into the center, what they call the middle belt of Nigeria, with these Fulani raiders, or Fulani herdsmen, they would sometimes call them, but they're really militant Islamists. And really, the way the story has been accurately described is that there is a process of Islamization of the country, that people who believe that the only true Nigerian is a Muslim. And so the hostility has been almost completely one-sided in terms of the violence of one group against the other. It has been almost completely Muslims against Christians. And the fact that the government for the last 8 to 10 years has also been run by, in fact, Buhari, who recently stepped down, the president of the country, was a member of that same ethnic group, the Fulanis. And noteworthy was the negligence with which the government did any sort of follow-up or any sort of enforcement of laws for the protection of Christians.
Yeah, that mentality of believing, like in Nigeria, that the country only real Nigerians are Muslims is very similar to the sort of situation in India, with the only true Indian being Hindu. So, how many countries is that type of attitude prevalent?
Oh, many more than we would suppose. So I'll give you some examples. You've named a couple. You've got Nigeria. You've got the case of the Hindu nationalists in India, very strong there. Yemen, Syria to a large extent, Iran, Iraq to a slightly lesser degree, but Iraq is still present there as well. Let's think of some others here. Eritrea, um,
Where is that?
Ethiopia, so that's North Africa.
Okay.
Um, there are a number of Islamic majority countries, or in a lot of them, or Afghanistan is another good example. Pakistan is another very good example. Those are two. Both of those are Islamic republics. We often don't hear that name, but it's actually part of the full name of the country. They are confessional states, and there are places where it is illegal to convert, for example, a Muslim to Christianity. We've had all those cases of in Pakistan, for example, under their blasphemy laws, where anyone who says anything against the prophet or tries to proselytize or evangelize Muslims, they're often killed by mobs. Sometimes they're actually taken into to a court, but when they have been killed by mobs, you don't see any sort of prosecution of those who are culpable. They just turn. There's a blind eye turned, and it's really scary to think what Christians have to go to in these countries. Remember the
Yeah.
very emblematic case of Asia Bibi, who was in jail for 10 years because of trumped up charges that said that she was trying to evangelize other women standing around a well when they were working. And it was simply because she was Christian and they hated her and they wanted to see her. So they brought the case and she was thrown in jail and left there for 10 years.
It's interesting that she was by a well because it just makes me think of Bible stories.
Yeah. The Samaritan
Um,
woman. Yeah. That it ended a lot better for the Samaritan woman than it did for poor Aisha Bibi.
yeah. So, but we did, I mentioned India. I don't think many people think of Hinduism as a sort of an aggressive religion. Is that is that more so now, or less so, or previously? Like has it always been that way? Is it now? Is it becoming that way now?
Well, we do have this idea, and I think it's a partially false idea of Hinduism as being a very pacifist, very non-aggressive sort of belief system. And when it's pushed to it, that's not the case at all. And I'll give you an example that kind of illustrates this. The caste system, which is not an interreligious thing at all, it's within Hinduism and the structure of Hinduism itself. But the rigid way and the very I would say, intransigent way that is enforced, that you are at that level, you cannot move. There's no mobility out of your caste. And if you happen to be a pariah, an untouchable of the lowest caste, that you will be treated as really a second class citizen, almost no better than an animal. And this is something, so we have this idea of these kind of lovey dovey Hindus, and I don't mean to in any way demean Hinduism as a religion or as a group, but there is very much that potential for a much more aggressive treatment of those who are outsiders in some way. And Christians have been particularly susceptible to this in recent years.
Yeah, I think people often think of Gandhi mostly.
Hmm.
Is that is that is did he give a false impression of Hinduism?
No, I don't think it was false. I think Gandhi was just an exceptional human being. By all accounts, I think he was really, a beautiful human being. And I wish that all Hindus, I wish that all Christians looked like Jesus too. But I wish that all Hindus, looked a little bit more like Gandhi and took his example. I think that, a lot of times this kind of persecution, this kind of lashing out comes from a position of fear and a position of when someone feels threatened, then they lash out in a very aggressive way. And I think Christianity sometimes does that to people where they can feel that, there's something very attractive about the Christian religion. There's something very attractive about the example of Jesus. And I think that can seem threatening to those who don't espouse it.
Yeah, this isn't a religious comparison, but it kind of makes me think of the Ukrainian situation, sort of like like causes of the Russian-Ukrainian war. If you feel threatened, you might become you might act out.
Hmm.
violently.
That's a
Yeah.
really good point. Yeah, and I think that that is clearly the case. Wherever there are lots of different nuances, obviously, to this whole situation,
Hmm.
but there's no question that given his position, Putin and the Russian Federation um, felt threatened by Ukraine's rapprochement with NATO, with you know having their border what they thought was possibly under as being vulnerable to attack, and also quite honestly the fact that the Russian Empire, both the former Russian Empire and then the Russian Empire under the Soviet Union, extended so much further. There was
Yeah.
also a feeling of being hemmed in beyond the borders, and they still want to re-extend that back out to where they think those borders belong.
Yeah. Uh, so it's interesting. So we talked about sort of persecution amongst Christians in Nigeria. Is that also the place where Catholics are most persecuted? Is Nigeria, or is there another country where specifically Catholics are being persecuted?
Well, I mean, Nigeria is divided in terms of denominations. There's a very strong Catholic presence, but I don't think Catholics tend to be singled out, particularly in Nigeria. I think Christians themselves are seen as one single group. I think by the Muslims there, Muslims are not really, parsing those theological and historic differences. Places where Catholics as a group are more, well, people make distinctions. For example, in China, we could take the example of China, where there's a nominal sort of religious freedom guaranteed by the Chinese constitution. But there, as we know, the Catholic Church is roughly divided in two, between the underground Catholic Church and the Catholic Church that is accepted and friendly to the government because it's associated with the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, which is state run and state monitored. This is something where the state feels like they have control and they feel comfortable with that. Whereas the underground church that has historically been faithful to Rome and to the Pope is something that they feel they don't control. And they feel much more, I think, frightened and also much more determined to root that out. And so you do get a situation where a very particular group of Catholics, the underground Catholic Church, is singled out and targeted specifically for an awful lot of persecution.
Yeah, there have been many criticisms of Pope Francis regarding his dealing with the CCP, and it just makes me wonder, how should the Catholic Church be reacting to the growing threats to its people in these persecutions?
Well, I think in the case of China, I think a lot, and this comes out constantly in leaked reports from within China. Members of the underground church really feel thrown under the bus by the Vatican and by the Pope at this time. They feel like they've been abandoned. And particularly the most egregious example of this was when the Pope, in July, I think it was of 2020, if I'm not mistaken, the year, when he said that Catholics could now, prelates and clergy and lay people alike, could now become members of the Patriotic Association, which has always been forbidden to Catholics because it is declaredly independent from Rome. It does not owe any allegiance to the Pope. It doesn't accept the hierarchy of the church. And the problem is when you allow this to be a possibility, then you give a big stick to the Chinese government, to Beijing, because they say, well, if you don't choose to do that now that you're allowed to do it, it's because you're stubborn. It's not because you're being faithful to the church. It's not because you're being faithful to Rome. It's because you are pigheaded. You don't want to do it because, in your mind, it betrays your little principles, but your church allows it, so you should be doing it. And this is something I find, very, very sad, tragic, honestly.
Yeah. So, is there anything that they can be doing, that they
Well,
should be doing?
I think what the church has always tried to do, and we should constantly do, is to be supportive of our persecuted brothers and sisters in their situation, and to hold them up as examples for the rest of the church, examples for the world of people who are faithful and suffer because of their fidelity. I mean, this is whether it's red martyrdom or white martyrdom, that constant situation of harassment and persecution, and often jail time, and sometimes worse, is an ongoing thing, and they deserve to be held up as real heroes of the faith rather than kind of marginalized, put aside as people who are not keeping up with the times with this new culture of dialogue.
Yeah. It is back to kind of Nigeria too specifically. I mentioned the 47%. It's just so interesting to me that such a large percentage of Nigerians are Christian and are under persecution. Is there any like growing desire to be like m- uh defensively militant in Nigeria, defending themselves?
I've seen no evidence of that, and I think it's probably not a bad thing. What you don't want is a religious war. I don't
Okay.
think you want, and I'm always reading the statements and pronouncements of the Catholic hierarchy within the country, and where they have been very, very clear about the problem of the persecution. They have the thrust of their message has been one to the government, that the government needs to live up to the expectations of the people and start defending the rights, especially the rights of religious freedom of all its citizens and not just one particular group. And I think that's the strategy that they've chosen rather than calling to arms Catholics and other Christians to actually, resist. And again, the defensive way and sometimes being in some kind of, self-imposed lockdown, there's a lot of that, trying to have strongholds. There are bunkers built, honestly, around a lot of Christian establishments, schools, and parishes, just to try to defend against this sort of attack. But there hasn't been any real call, and I think there's a good thing for Christians to be taking up arms against Muslims there.
Is there a potential where the persecutions become so bad that becomes a possibility? As horrible it would be.
Well, yeah, and the problem is it very easily gets out of hand. Obviously, self-defense is always a right of every human being, and certainly a right of Christians. Um, I'm thrown back in time to the Cristero Revolution in Mexico, and that Cristero uprising was armed Christians, armed Catholics in this case, almost 100% Catholics, who were against this Masonic government that was constantly repressing and harassing them. And it was Pius XI who, I think it was in 1934, actually asked them to lay down their arms. He at one point said to the Cristeros, we have to put down the arms now and stop this ongoing conflict. And as soon as they did, they were massacred. It was actually a tragic story where the end result was nothing like I'm sure Pius XI would have expected or hoped. And it showed also the brutality that enemies of the church will sometimes go to when they have the upper hand like that.
Yeah, and I bet that felt like a big betrayal for all of the Cristeros. Uh, they were very respectful of their hierarchy of listening to the Pope, and then they do what they're told to do, and they lose because of it.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, I remember when the first time I had contact with that history, and it's just so, it's like a gut punch to see what happened. And yeah, and they did it because they were true Catholics and they were trying to be faithful to what the Holy Father wanted, and yet it ended up in being so many of them being slaughtered for it.
Yeah, it can be hard being Catholic in that specific way.
Yes.
Um, so do you see? This is kind of my final question. Is Christianity in the West in danger of moving to the catacombs?
I think this is always a danger, and I hope we resist that urge. The kind of fortress mentality, we have to just hunker down and hide away and build walls and hide behind them. I think it's very tempting when society becomes very aggressive and becomes very harsh in its way of treating Christians. But the Christian message has always been one, and this comes from our Lord himself, of going out to the whole world, making disciples of the nations. It's not of hiding and just trying to hold on to what we have. We are an evangelizing and missionary faith, and we are called to proclaim Christ to the ends of the earth, no matter what that means in terms of our personal health and well-being, if you will, our personal comfort many times. It's what we're called. We're called to witness to Jesus. And I think there might be individual cases where people don't have that responsibility in a given moment because of the predicament that they're in. But for most of us, that's what we're called to do. We're called to be out there and playing offense, not defense, and not hiding away in some kind of fortress, but really out there proclaiming the truth. And the chips will fall where they may.
I'm not sure that this necessarily would would disagree with you or anything like that, but I know the Benedict option has become very prominent, and sort of in some ways building. I think it's like, isn't it building a society kind of apart?
Yeah, I'm not an enormous fan. I think
Sure.
the Benedictine spirituality and the actual reality of Benedictine monasticism is something I think slightly different. I think the reason it's different is that's always called to be a minority, those who separate themselves from the world, to pray for the world, to witness to the world from that situation. That's not a call for the entire church to hide in the catacombs. That's a call for people who have a specific vocation to live that out away from the world, and specifically in radical witness and in prayer, in active prayer for the Christians who are engaged in the world as leaven in society. And I think that we can't forget that that is the majority of us. I think that there are those who are called to retire from the world. There always have been. Monastic life is a beautiful reality. Being the hermits, the fathers of the desert. I mean, there's so many examples in history of these very important movements, but there were always small minorities of people who felt a very particular call to that. It was never meant to be something, come on, let's all go. Let's all go to the desert. Let's all go to the catacombs. That's just not the way it was ever meant to be.
Yeah, the very opposite of that is very much the Dominican way, where they go into cities and they're preaching, and in sort of doing battle with whatever the the false view of the world is at the time.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. I mean, we need both. We need both. My only fear is that when the Benedict option starts becoming looked upon as this should be, a mass appeal for everyday Catholics, I think that it becomes a little problematic. I think it loses a little bit of the spirit of what the Benedictines really were and are still in the world today.
Yeah, no, it's a great insight, and a good way of looking at how we can't be afraid. We can't be afraid of the persecution to come. We can't, because otherwise we're setting ourselves up to probably lose even more.
Absolutely. If you hide away, what are you going to do? I mean, you no longer engage, you no longer contribute, you're no longer part of the conversation. You're not making the argument. You're not proclaiming. And when a Christian stops proclaiming Jesus to the world, that is it kind of I don't know. It neutralizes that effect of being salt and being light. This is what Jesus calls us. Salt is meant to transform the taste and to preserve and to transform. Light is meant to, all of a sudden people see things, and this is a real reality of the Christian vis-a-vis society. This is what we're called to be. We're called to actually have an effect on society, not to be withdrawn and just to be hiding from that society with all its evils, but actually to be changing it.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate your thoughts on that subject, and I greatly appreciate that you've written this book, and that you've been able to come on to the show to discuss it. Is there anything else that you want to sort of promote or add, or tell people where to find you, and that sort of thing?
Oh, sure. And thank you, Connor. It's been a privilege, honestly, for me to be on your show, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. If people want, on Twitter, people can find me at tdwilliams TD Williams Rome, at TD Williams Rome. And the other option would be I have a website, www.thomasdwilliams.com.
Yeah, this is your 18th book, so
Yes.
you've been incredibly busy writing books, and so people can also check out your other work, and if they're really interested. But obviously, they should get this book first. Uh, and again, that's Crisis Publications. I will have a link to that in the description. I assume that's the best place to get the book.
Yeah, SophiaInstitutePress.com has the book there. It's on Amazon too. It's
Oh, it's
where
Sophia
most books are
Institute.
sold. Yeah.
Okay, I'll link that. Um, well, really, thank you again for coming on the show. For everyone watching, if you like this episode, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. We want this conversation to go to as many people as possible. If you think this is a conversation that people should hear more of, please help support this. And also, we have a Discord, so if you want to continue the conversation off of YouTube or Rumble or off of podcast apps, if you want to have a little more time or an opportunity to have contact with me and ask questions and even have questions for guests in the future, that's a great place to go to be able to do that. But thank you again, Dr. Williams, and God bless. Bye.
Thank you. God bless you too, Connor, and your great work. Thank you.